Hi from Hannah Mary. This is our third, I believe, live read aloud. The last one was for Leif Erikson Day, and this is for Thanksgiving. So we have a Thanksgiving book to sample from today. I've been reading a couple of Thanksgiving books recently, and this is one of them, Thanksgiving, A Time to Remember by Barbara Rainey. And another one is the Plymouth Plantation records by William Bradford. I mix up some of the names of those initial Pilgrims, but Bradford was a governor, an early governor of the colony in Boston, the Massachusetts colony. So he wrote several decades worth of history from when the Pilgrims arrived on the Mayflower and in through the years ahead. And I was amazed at what they went through. What I'll be reading you from here gives just a little idea of the first couple of years. If you're like me, I used to think that the Pilgrims, after they had their tough first year and so many of them died from illness, that then they had their first Thanksgiving and everything was great. They were well-fed and had great crops and harvests. But that's not actually the case. It was not quite that easy. So we're going to read some of this. It has parts in small font and some in large font. And that is because this book is set up that you can read to children just the large font sections, and that makes it a lot shorter, more concise. I'll do a bit of both, but not all of the small font. For an entire day, November 10th, 1620. Oh, this isn't the chapter I was going to read. That's on the Mayflower. I'm going to jump ahead, and I'm going to start 400 years ago now. So in by October 1621, the corn planted that spring was ready for harvest. The fields yielded a large crop that would keep the colony from starvation in the coming winter. Their hearts were full of gratitude for their renewed health, for the abundant harvest, and for the peace they enjoyed with the Indians. William Bradford, that's who I was saying wrote the other book, of Plymouth Plantation is what he wrote, who at only 30 years of age had been elected leader of the colony after the death of John Carver that summer, was thankful for the harvest. As the new governor, he declared that Plymouth should hold a Thanksgiving festival and invite the settlement's Indian friends as special guests. A date was set and an invitation delivered to Chief Massasoit. To make sure there was adequate food, the Pilgrim men went hunting and fishing. In just a day, enough wild turkeys, eels, geese, lobsters, partridge, and shellfish were gathered to guarantee a great feast. But when Massasoit arrived with 90 hungry braves, all smeared with ceremonial bear grease, the Pilgrims became worried. How could they feed that many people? And if they used too much of their precious stockpiled corn, would they have an adequate food supply to survive the winter? Fortunately, the Indians along the Atlantic coast were also accustomed to celebrating the harvest with what they called the green corn dance. They thought the Pilgrim Festival must be the white man's version of this observance. So when Massasoit and his men arrived at Plymouth, they too went to the woods and seashore to gather food. Soon 5 deer and more fish and seafood were presented for roasting. The Pilgrims breathed a sigh of relief and began preparing the meal. When it was time to eat, the menu was impressive. Venison, goose, lobster, eel, oysters, clam chowder, parsnips, turnips, cucumbers, onions, carrots, cabbage, beets, radishes, and dried fruit that included gooseberries, strawberries, cherries, and plums. Some of the fruit was cooked inside dough to make a crude pie. The newly harvested corn was ground and served in the form of ash cakes or hoe cakes, a thin slice of bread baked in a fire on the blade of a hoe. A special treat was supplied by the Indians. They placed corn on hot coals, and the kernels blew into white puffs, popcorn. The Indians dribbled maple syrup over the white snack and made popcorn balls. The beverage was a fresh wine made by the Pilgrims from the summer's fruit crop. But before they began to eat, their spiritual leader offered a prayer to the God who had so clearly and miraculously led them to this place. Though they had suffered much, their experience was remarkably better than others who had attempted to colonize on the American shores. Plymouth had lost 50% of its numbers, but Jamestown in Virginia had lost 90%. The Plymouth settlers had successfully built a little community and grown crops to provide for themselves, while other colonies were totally dependent for supplies on the arrival of ships from England. Yes, God had blessed them abundantly, and they sincerely offered him their thanks and praise. I just realized when I said Boston earlier, that comes later in the of Plymouth Plantation history in the next decades. It's actually Plymouth is what it's called at this point. The feasting continued over a 3-day period, during which both Indians and Pilgrims participated in games and exhibitions of shooting skill with bows and arrows and guns. The Pilgrim boys joined the races and wrestling matches of the Indians, and in turn the Indians learned how to play stool ball, a game resembling croquet played with a ball and wickets. At night the Indians slept in nearby fields. The relationship between the settlers and Indians was now so solid and peaceful that the Pilgrims no longer posted guards. When the fun and feasting ended, both Indians and colonists agreed that they wanted to have a similar feast the following year. Now I can show you, there are special pages throughout here. This is to skip right now because it is not in the storyline, but there's so much more information on these extra pages. In November, a ship from England, so this is after the first Thanksgiving 400 years ago. In November, a ship from England, the Fortune, arrived unexpectedly and delivered 35 new colonists, which nearly doubled their numbers. Though they were delighted to see fresh faces, some of which belonged to family members, the existing residents were sobered to realize that the new recruits had come without extra food, clothing, or other provisions. Soon after the newcomers were assigned to families in the colony, the leaders met to plan for their survival. Governor Bradford and William Brewster reached the difficult decision. Everyone would go on half rations through the winter. The abundant harvest of corn they had so recently stored for that second winter of 1621 to 1622 was now not nearly enough. They began that winter cautiously, with everyone getting their half ration of corn, hopeful that the men could find enough game and fish to see them through. Supplies dwindled quickly. Legend has it that at one point the food stores were so low that everyone was forced to a daily ration of only 5 kernels of corn. And it's amazing to think that anyone could survive on so little food, yet no one died of starvation. Once again, at the height of their need, God provided deliverance. Another ship sailed into their harbor, and though it did not have food, the captain did have trading goods that he offered in exchange for beaver pelts. With the trading goods, the Pilgrims bartered with the Indians for more corn. The extra corn enabled them to survive the second winter, although they were considerably thinner. When the spring of 1622 finally arrived, the colony was much weakened by hunger and sickness, and the famine was not over. The weary Pilgrims went to the fields to plant their common crops, but their enthusiasm was greatly reduced. However, they continued on with the life that God had given them. They had many dealings with their Indian friends, continued exploring the land, and obtained what sustenance they could by fishing, hunting, and bartering with the Indians. Edward Winslow described their sad condition that spring, saying that the bay and creeks were full of fish, but their seines and netting were torn and rotten. He wrote that were it not for shellfish of different kinds that could be taken by hand, they would have perished. Another colony was begun to the north, and other ships arrived in Cape Cod Bay several times that year, usually bringing colonists without supplies of any kind. Neither Bradford's journal nor the writings of other Pilgrims record a Thanksgiving celebration in that second harvest season. Bradford did write, "The welcome time of harvest approached, but it arose but to a little. So it well appeared that famine must still ensue the next year also. This is not what we really think of after that first Thanksgiving. The second Thanksgiving couldn't be held as a feast because of another famine. Again, God saw them through the winter of 1622 to 23 by means of another ship, which brought trading goods they could use to barter for corn with the Indians. Planting time was soon upon them in April of 1623. Their needs were desperate. The Pilgrims realized they had to plant double the previous year's crop to sustain them in the winter to come. This year it was decided they would seed a common cornfield for the whole colony, and then each family would be given a parcel of land to plant for its own use. Everyone was enthusiastic, for they were eager to grow as much as possible to avoid another starving time. William Bradford observed, "This had very good success, for it made all hands very industrious, so as much more corn was planted than otherwise would have been." The women now went willingly to the field and took their little ones with them to help set corn. Soon after the plantings, however, the weather turned dry. As the weeks of drought went by, the Pilgrims watched their precious summer crops wither and slowly die. The Indians said they never had seen a dry spell like it. After 12 weeks, the Pilgrims realized they would face certain starvation in the coming winter if it did not rain soon. The colonists were losing hope. They wondered if God, who had always gone before them, was against them. They began to pray. William Bradford asked everyone to participate in a day of fasting and prayer to the Lord to ask for rain. Again, we are reading from Thanksgiving, A Time to Remember by Barbara Rainey, and it comes with a CD of music in the back that we are listening to for all week here, and sections for young and old, a place to journal and keep your gratitude list in the back. And I'll just read you a little bit more about what happened because I left you in the middle of a drought. They had their first Thanksgiving. The next year was a famine, so they didn't have a feast. The next summer, they planted, and their crops were just dying. All the Pilgrims felt a deep sense of humility before God, and they sincerely sought His mercy. Edward Winslow described what happened. "But, oh, the mercy of our God, who was as ready to hear as we were to ask. For though in the morning, when we assembled together, the heavens were as clear and the drought as like to continue as ever it was, yet, before our departure from the day of prayer and fasting, the weather was overcast, the clouds gathered on all sides. On the next morning distilled such soft, sweet, and moderate showers of rain, continuing some 14 days. Such was the bounty and goodness of our God." Bradford wrote, "It came without either wind or thunder or any violence, and by degrees in that abundance as that the earth was thoroughly wet and soaked therewith, which did so apparently revive and quicken the decayed corn and other fruits, as was wonderful to see, and made the Indians astonished to behold. If the Pilgrims were amazed at God's answer to their prayers and His great deliverance, imagine how wide-eyed with wonder the Indians were. They had no knowledge of the God of the Pilgrims, a personal, benevolent God who cared about His people. God was displaying His wonders." Winslow concluded his description of this miraculous event with his thoughts on the Indians' response. "All of them admired the goodness of our God towards us, that wrought so great a change in so short a time, showing the difference between their conjuration, rain dances, and our invocation on the name of God for rain, theirs being mixed with such storms and tempests as sometimes, instead of doing them good, it layeth the corn flat on the ground to their prejudice, but ours in so gentle and seasonable a manner as they never observed the like. Praise the Lord, great things He hath done." The crops were saved. Another answer to prayer came about 2 weeks later. The ship Anne, which was carrying many family members and friends to join the colony, had been reported lost at sea, but now it arrived safely at Plymouth Harbor. The newcomers, however, were shocked and dismayed at the condition of their friends and relatives. Bradford wrote that it was no wonder the newcomers were surprised. The Pilgrims were thin and gaunt, wearing ragged clothes, some little better than half naked. Not exactly like how we picture pilgrims, right? All beautifully dressed and clean and arms full of food. But God was sustaining them. It goes on to say, the only food they could offer in welcome was a lobster or piece of fish with no bread and nothing else but a cup of spring water. Bradford concluded by saying, But God gave them health and strength in good measure, and showed them by experience the truth of the word in Deuteronomy 8:3, that man lives not by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds out of the mouth of the Lord. That harvest season was an abundant one. There was even a surplus to trade with the Indians for what they needed that winter. They had much to celebrate. Another day of Thanksgiving was planned this year, probably in August or September. The Indians were again invited with their chief, Massasoit. It was a season of gratitude. They were grateful for the rain and the harvest. They were grateful for the safe arrival of their family members and friends. They were grateful for the marriage of their wise Governor Bradford to Alice Southworth, who had also arrived on the Anne, because Governor Bradford's wife actually that came with him died really quickly when they arrived. Lastly, and most importantly, they celebrated with grateful hearts God's goodness to them. Edward Winslow wrote that, having these many signs of God's favor and acceptance, we thought it would be a great ingratitude if secretly we should content ourselves with private thanksgiving for that which by private prayer could not be obtained, referring to the day of prayer and fasting earlier that summer. And therefore another solemn day was set apart and appointed for that end, wherein we returned glory, honor, and praise with all thankfulness to our God, who dealt so graciously with us. As they expressed their gratitude and thanksgiving to God, they remembered the famine they had so recently experienced. No one would soon forget the meager rations they had lived on for nearly 2 years. Though they didn't soon forget, we have. Nearly 400 years later, it was written a few years ago, now exactly 400 years later, we who are the beneficiaries of their sacrifice pause at the end of the harvest season to celebrate a day of Thanksgiving. There are many lessons we can learn from this story, but they all come back to faith. The Pilgrims sailed to America because of their faith. They wrote the Mayflower Compact based on God's word and signed it by faith. They persevered in the harsh climate because of their faith. They befriended the Native Americans because of their faith. And side note, it's really interesting of Plymouth Plantation by William Bradford, hearing how they worked so closely with some of the Indian tribes and helped protect them from the hostile Indians that were fighting among tribes. And so it was, they were bringing peace to the land and helping, mutually encouraging and helping Indians and helping them survive. And where was I? Their uncompromising belief in God and His Word became the cornerstone of the colony and in turn of the new nation. It is doubtful that the Thanksgiving celebration in 1623 began with 5 kernels of corn on each plate, as tradition tells us. The recent famine was too fresh in their memories to need a visual reminder. It is, however, a tradition that should be continued in our generation. William Bradford once wrote these words that should stir our hearts to greater levels of thankfulness for all we possess and enjoy. We have noted these things so that you might see their worth and not negligently lose what your fathers have obtained with so much hardship. May we Americans remember every year what a rich legacy we have been given, so that we might express gratitude to God and not negligently lose what our fathers have obtained with so much hardship. So if you missed any of this live, you can go back once it's published and hear what that hardship was. You might be surprised, like I was. It wasn't just all Thanksgiving feast and easy sailing from then on. So I hope you enjoyed that little sample from Thanksgiving, A Time to Remember by Barbara Rainey. I'm not sure if this book is in print anymore. I don't think it's easy to find, but you can maybe find it used. And it's been a blessing to our family, and I think it would be for yours as well. So I will say happy Thanksgiving and God bless you. And here's one of our favorite decorations. It's probably backwards on here, but it says, "We give thanks to God." People talk about giving thanks and being thankful and gratitude, but to whom? I mean, our gratitude needs an object, needs someone to be grateful to. Of course, we can be grateful to each other and to our family and to our friends, but ultimately, we can't thank them for life and breath and everything that needs to be thanked. Needs our thanks to be given to God. So happy Thanksgiving.